think we should think about the force of the clairvoyance objection. Is it really strong? Bonjour sort of gives it as if it were a sort of master objection, as if it were clear that this shows externalism is wrong. And so I think we should think about whether it really is so clear. And so part of the reason we might worry about it is that Bonjour sort of waffles a little bit in how he talks about the notion of justification. He talks in two different ways about justification. Sometimes he talks about Norman's belief being justified. But more often than that, he has this different turn of phrase. He talks about Norman's acceptance of his belief being justified or unjustified. So he asks the question about not Norman's belief, but his acceptance of his belief. And these seem to be different things. I'm not even entirely clear on what an acceptance of a belief is. Maybe it's something like Norman's consciously coming to form the belief, or his allowing the belief to remain without submitting it to rational scrutiny. But that is different than just the belief itself, we might think. And so we can maybe see this difference by thinking about on the one hand, we have an action of coming to or continuing to believe being justified. And on the other hand, we have this question of whether a belief itself is justified. So is the action of coming to or continuing to believe something justified? And is the belief itself justified? And as Connie and Feldman brought to our attention in the first reading of this section, they sort of said, look, we need to keep these notions separate, these notions of whether you're justified in forming your belief or maintaining it, and whether the belief itself is justified. The first might be closely tied to blameworthiness and criticism, as they sort of talked about it in their paper, but the second, as they said, didn't need to be. And so we should worry about whether Bonjour is simply changing the subject in exactly the way they warn against, changing the subject from focusing on the justification of beliefs to something else. And this is relevant because the externalist position is one about what makes a belief justified, not about what makes an agent's acceptance of a belief justified, or the action of coming to have a belief or continuing to believe justified. It's about what makes the belief itself justified. And it's not obvious that Bonjour's addressing that. So we still are left with this question, does the argument still succeed? So it might still be that we just don't think Norman's belief is justified. So it's not that his acceptance of his belief isn't justified. It's that his belief actually isn't justified in the case where he gets the belief by clairvoyance. And perhaps that's right. Maybe all of Bonjour's sloppiness here is just merely that, sloppiness, and not trying to pull the wool over our eyes. But we can worry, I think, that the subjective position is less important when we're thinking about when we're thinking about his belief being justified, and more important when we're thinking about actions being justified. So something that he has voluntary control over, we might think, yeah, the subjective position is very important for justification. But that might not be so when we're thinking about the belief itself. And so I think we want to question whether this really is as knockdown of an argument as it appears to be. I still think it is a serious hurdle for the externalist and the reliabilist in particular, but it's not as obvious, I think, as Bonjour makes it sound.